Last July, I was invited to speak at a convention in Boston, and I had been asked to talk on instant insanity drugs. And I don't know whether it was the subject or something else, but all the hippies came to town. And so we felt quite at home, in a sense, at least with our topic. And like so many of these young people that feel they have a protest to present, they had signs. And they had strange slogans on them, things like, "God is dead, long live love." I couldn't quite get the connection, but anyway, there they were. God is dead, long live love. And I got to thinking about it, and I had an opportunity to get a little button. And I said to my family, these young people believe in signs, so I'm going to get me one. And this button had rather large letters, so it was easy to read, so that as I walked along the street, I could just turn back my lapel so it could be easily read. So every time I'd come to one of these groups with a sign saying, "God is dead," I'd pull back my lapel, and the button said, "My God is alive. Sorry about yours." But I thought afterwards, these young people have been born into sort of a mixed-up generation, when the prophecy of Isaiah is literally coming to pass, that men will arise who call good evil and evil good, and whose criteria for morals will be the very opposite of God, and all the things that history and experience has taught us will be repudiated in the name of progress and freedom and self-expression and self-realization. And that's the day in which we live. And we see so many forces around us that are constantly winning over good. We see the erosion of the great principles that made us a wonderful, wealthy, free people and a free nation. We see many forces that we have always stood against under our Judeo-Christian code. Sometimes the pulpits of the churches, the rostrums of the universities, are utilized for the purpose of deprecating the very things that make for happy living and strong, free peoples. And because we hear so much of this dinned into our ears, we sometimes think that good doesn't ever succeed. But it does. And tonight we're going to talk about it. Because every so often, God comes across with a fantastic victory. And when he does, it's not designed just for one people. It's designed for all people. And I want to talk about that tonight. Because when God reaps a victory, it's designed for the good of all. Now, from his standpoint, some history is much more important than others. And that's why it pays to study prophecy, because through his prophets, he has pinpointed the highlights of history that he knows will be very significant. And you and I, who may fight in World War I and World War II and in Korea, in South Vietnam, these in their way are highly significant. And to the extent that we shed our blood for the cause of freedom, it becomes precious and sacred as a contribution to humanity. But there are other things which God knows represents a hinge on which the door of the future opens. And so I'll be talking about that tonight, because it was a very important segment of history. What many people didn't realize last summer, when we had the war between primarily Egypt and Syria and Israel and Jordan, was that this was not a war just between Jews and Arabs. This was a direct confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union, and it had been boiling up ever since World War II. And unless we appreciate that that's what has happened, we don't understand what is now happening. You see, as World War II came to its conclusion, so did the British Empire. And while Winston Churchill hoped that the end had not come for the imperial strength of Great Britain it had. And economically and otherwise, Britain found it necessary to retreat, first from one part of the world and then another. And a vacuum was created wherever she retreated, whether from the Far East, the Mediterranean, or from Africa. And the Soviet Union was determined to fill in the gap. Now, this is what was happening in the Mediterranean. All of you are witnesses to the fact that in your lifetime you saw the British Empire dismantled, and you saw the British fleet disappear from the Mediterranean. You saw the British lose the Suez Canal. Today, do you know that the only British ships in the whole Mediterranean are a few minesweepers? Gone are all the men of war. Gone are the vast armies that once represented the Western civilization from the British point of view in that region. The vacuum that has been left was not designed to be filled up by the United States. We wanted Greece to fill her own part of the vacuum. We wanted Italy to be her responsible segment of the Mediterranean. We wanted Turkey to be a responsible segment. We wanted each of the Arab countries to stand on their own feet and become economically and politically stable. And therefore we threw the Sixth Fleet into the Mediterranean for the express purpose of seeing that those countries were sufficiently protected so that they could work out their own destinies. Now, the Soviet Union has worked very carefully to try and resolve this matter. She has used subterfuge, she has used revolution, she has used various forms of violence, but always undercover. And so you've had Arabs killing Arabs, and they have tried to get Greeks to kill Turks and Turks to kill Greeks. The whole idea of the Soviet Union from the beginning has been to get one people to kill another and then have the Soviet Union pick up the remnants in the grasp of her ambition for worldwide power. So that's been going on there ever since World War II. Now, the United States knew that Israel was critical, but so was each of the Arab nations. And so in 1955 we said to the Arabs, will you all join with those countries that border on the Soviet Union in a Baghdad pact, so that we can say to the Soviet Union, you are welcome to come to trade and to visit and so forth in peace, but not in war, not with espionage and sabotage and subversion. And so this was the message that the Baghdad Pact was supposed to send out. However, the Arab nations were divided. We had the Persian nation of Iran, we had the old Mesopotamian nation of Iraq, and we had Turkey and Great Britain combined in that pact. But the Arabs were sort of unbalanced. And so we did everything we could to let the Arab nations know we wanted to be friends. We've given them over $4 billion worth of aid. Now, the ones that sided with us was Jordan, east of Palestine, Lebanon, to a certain extent Saudi Arabia, and, of course, Iran, which is Persian, came our way eventually. Iraq started out on our side, but the communists moved in. One of the generals joined them and killed the king and his prime minister, and Iraq has been pro-communist ever since, so we lost Iraq. And Nasser had just come to power, so he balanced the United States against the Soviet Union. Most of our folks don't remember these headlines of 1956, but let me just remind you briefly what happened. Nasser had just come to power, had entered into an arms pact with the Soviet Union. The United States had offered to build the Aswan Dam and give them all kinds of wheat and food to show our friendship. So Nasser had to decide whether he was going to use both the Soviet Union and the United States, or whether he would just decide to go one way or the other. His decision apparently went toward the Soviet Union. In any event, he began to use very abusive language against the United States, even while he was receiving aid. He started to fight the Baghdad Pact. He moved closer to the Soviet Union. The President of the United States and John Foster Dulles were so unhappy with his ungratefulness that they said, well, then we will not build the Aswan Dam. Nasser said, all right, then I will grab the Suez Canal and use the resources from the canal to build the Aswan Dam. And so he took possession of the canal, which belonged, the stock in it belonged to Britain and France. So Britain and France moved down to protect their interests and keep it open for international trade. And to unite all Arab nations, Nasser attacked Israel. He moved all of his forces right down to the border of Israel, closed the Gulf of Aqaba that cut off all of Israel's oil, and got all poised for the attack when something happened many of our people have forgotten. The Jews had a one-eyed general, very young then, named Moshe Dayan. And Dayan was born in Israel. He was not a European Jew. He had put his life on the altar for the liberty of his country on numerous occasions. And just as the Egyptians were about to launch their attack, he launched a defensive attack in the middle of the night and just swamped the Egyptian troops in a panic. It was very much like the situation where Gideon, with just 300 men, came up in the middle of the night, smashed the pitchers, held up the torches, blew the horn, and they all started fighting each other down in the valley, thinking the enemy was their brother. Well, this was almost as bad. When I was over in Israel, I found that the Jews had sent down and brought back truckloads of shoes that the Egyptian soldiers abandoned in the sand so they could run faster getting out of there. That was 1956. Now, who saved Nasser? The United States. Our policy suddenly shifted, and in our anxiety to win Nasser, we shifted position and joined the Soviet Union against France and England and forced a ceasefire that would leave the Suez Canal in the hands of Nasser. And then we put pressure on Israel to come back all across the Sinai that she'd occupied. And we guaranteed with the backing of the United States and the United Nations that if Israel would just go back to her original borders, that she would be supported in the integrity of those borders, that never again would the Aqaba Gulf be allowed to be closed, that it would be considered international waters. And under that pressure, in fact, our Secretary of State threatened sanctions against Israel if she didn't do it. Under those pressures, in 1956 and early 57, Israel consented and withdrew back to her original borders. Now, almost immediately, the communists, the Soviet Union made its thrust, and that's when they participated in the murder of the king of Iraq, and they had their own people in power, and they've been in power ever since, people that were friendly toward them. That's about the time, you remember when they tried to take Lebanon, and they tried to take Jordan? The Marines landed at Beirut, you remember that? And we took our planes, and the British supported us in that move, and we kept Jordan and Lebanon from going down. Now I think I've used enough names to thoroughly confuse you, so let me stop. Because if you're like me, I can tell you where Missouri is, and Maine, and Alberta, and the province of Sonora and Chihuahua in Mexico. I could locate Cuba for you on the map, but you start throwing Libya and Algiers and Lebanon and Iraq and Iran and Saudi Arabia and that around, and you just about have to get the map out. So let me just give you a setting for this so it'll make a little more sense. Many of you may have looked at your map recently, but in case you haven't, the Arabs occupy more than half of the whole Mediterranean basin. If you can visualize in your mind now a big map of Africa and the Mediterranean Sea and the Holy Land you're pretty familiar with, put it over there to the side on your map in your mind. Now start way over here at the side of Africa, Morocco, and come on across through Algiers and Tunisia and Libya and Egypt, then that great big deep continent which Lehi had to cross, that's Arabia, where all that good oil is. And now come up along the side of the Mediterranean. As you come up, you know where the Holy Land is? Everything east of the Jordan is called the nation of Jordan. And a big hunk of the territory to the west belonged to Jordan. Now go up north, that's Syria. And over on the coast, it's Lebanon. Now go over to the area between the Tigris and the Euphrates River. Remember old Assyria and old Babylon? That's Iraq. Now move a little further east to old Persia. That's Iran. And these are all Arabs. They're all Arabs. There aren't any more Carthaginians, no more Romans, no more Egyptians, no more Assyrians, no more Babylonians. All Arabs. What happened to those people that used to live there? Well, they were either assimilated or driven out. All Arabs today. Who are they? Well, they're the descendants of Abraham. Through Isaac's brother Ishmael and Isaac's son Esau. And Isaac's son Esau married a daughter of Ishmael, and so the Arabs say that they are people of the book, naturally. They are descendants of Abraham too. So it's a real shame that these people should be in direct conflict with each other. But this is the situation, and there are various reasons for it, which we try to cover in our book, Fantastic Victory, which I don't have time to cover tonight. But with this background of the Arabs now, covering all of North Africa, all of the territory up on the east side of the Middle East, the only people in that whole area who are not Arabs are the Jews in Israel, less than 3 million, against 110 million Arabs, and the Turks up north that occupy old Asia Minor, where Paul did all his good work. Now that's the setting for the story now we want to tell. Beginning in 1958, when the communists tried to move out and not only seize by violence, murder, assassination, and direct attack Iraq, Jordan, and Lebanon, but if they could have, they would have made a further showing, because Britain was moving out fast now. She'd lost the Suez Canal. Her program was unpopular in Britain itself, and the Soviet Union thought she could come forth. So she began to pour arms into Egypt, ready for the day when she would attack Israel. And we've been watching a variety of tactics used by the Arab leaders over the years for the purpose of harassing Israel. Now, when I went to the Holy Land the first time, it was kind of confusing, because we went first over on the Arab side, and the Arab people are lovable people. They're great people. And as they've demonstrated in Lebanon, you put Arabs under good leadership with a stable economy and stable leadership, and they make faster progress than any nation in which we've invested money among the underprivileged peoples. They are a great people. But their leaders, now that's something else again. And because their leaders will not allow any opposition press in most of the Arab countries, particularly in Syria and Egypt, they tend to make the people victims of the propaganda put out by the leaders. And I found that when I tried to talk to some of the people and point out things to them that was different than the propaganda they'd received, I didn't get very far. They couldn't quite hear me. As we went into Jordan, now that's east of Israel, that's over where Jesus was baptized, that's all along the Jordan River, all that territory, both east and the west bank. They would point out the refugee camps. And they said, do you know where these refugees came from? Thousands of them. In slum camps. Dirty, just terrible. No, where'd they come from? The Jews drove them out in the war of 1948 when they got their independence. Over 1 million of them. And they're over here and we're having to take care of them. In fact, the United Nations is taking care of them. And that sounded pretty bad. Until our chauffeur got me aside one night and he said, I am a refugee from Israel. And the situation is not like you are being told. It was the Arab leaders who invited us to leave Israel and to come out so that we wouldn't get shot up while they drove the Jews into the sea. It was only, as you probably remember, about 500,000 Jews against 6 Arab armies. I mean, they just weren't supposed to survive. So they said, all the Arabs, you get out while we drive the Jews in the sea. But they didn't. The Jews held. And the Jewish state was established just like the United Nations had agreed she should be established. And all these million Arabs were caught unable to go home. The Jews said they can come home just as soon as the other Arab nations recognize us and guarantee the integrity of our country. Then they can come home. The Arabs said, we will not recognize you. It is our destiny to annihilate you. So we will not recognize you. We are coming back again sometime. So meanwhile, their brother Arabs were put in concentration camps. They were not allowed to get jobs. They could not farm the land. I said to the chauffeur, this driver, how were you allowed to get a job? He said, for all these years, my wife and I have lived like animals in this camp. We are well educated. I said to them, turn us loose. We can make jobs. We will not take anybody else's jobs. We'll make jobs. But only when the tourist business became so good, he said, that they needed English-speaking translators, did they give me a chance to work because they didn't have enough English-speaking people. And so I am your driver. And that's the story. So then I began looking around a little more, and as I got over on the other side talking to the Jews, I asked them about it. They weren't even particularly anxious to discuss the subject. They said, well, it's past. There have been some very unhappy days, but you're here to have a good vacation, so let us go to Galilee, etc. And I said, no, I want to know more about the refugees. And so finally I got from them their story, verifying what the Arab refugee had said, that the Jews had even pleaded with the Arabs not to leave, that they didn't have to fight for the Jews, just don't fight against us, they said. But you don't have to leave, you can stay here. And they had trucks go up and down the street urging the Arabs to stay. But the Arab leaders said to the Arabs in Israel, come on out, we'll drive the Jews in the sea, and then you can go back and not only have your own land, your own stores, your own shops, but the Jews as well. So it looked like a good deal. And so over 1 million of them had left. Now that was the background of the refugee problem. Since that time, of course, in spite of all the propaganda to the contrary, the real setting for the refugee situation has been clarified from Arab sources, who are frank to admit that they did wrong to their fellow Arabs by literally imprisoning them when they couldn't go back to Israel. So I quoted those Arab sources in the Fantastic Victory so you'd see what the picture was. Now with this in mind, you will better understand the agitational forces that gradually began to build up these last 5 or 6 years. And we didn't hear too much about it over here, but there was constant guerrilla warfare between the surrounding Arab nations and Israel. The guerrillas would come in, fire, shoot, kill, and then run. And David Ben-Gurion, the prime minister, said, now I don't want anybody making irresponsible retaliatory attacks. We will try to get the United Nations to stop this, and if we have to defend ourselves, we'll do it officially. Don't anybody do it unofficially. So the Jews took it. There were deaths. I itemized the number who were killed in the latter part of the Fantastic Victory so you could see how serious it was. Finally, it would get so bad, the Jewish government, the Israeli government would decide to do something about it. And one of those occasions happened when I was there in 1962. We were up in Galilee. We wanted to go out on the Sea of Galilee. They said, you cannot go on the Sea of Galilee. The Arabs are shooting. The Arabs were using cannons way up high on the cliffs right above the Sea of Galilee. They were shooting any of the ships that were on the sea, and they were shooting Jewish villages over by Tiberias. And we were very disappointed we couldn't go out on the sea. They said, they will kill you. I said, well, this is crazy. Here were United Nations peacekeeping posts, 4 of them over on our side. We were then in the Jewish side. 10 of them over on the other side. 50 agents of the United Nations there to see that the peace was kept. And so I said, how long has this been going on? They said, oh, it's been going on off and on now for months. But it's been very bad this last little period. I said, what are you going to do about it? They said, David Ben-Gurion has given the United Nations 1 week to stop the shooting or we stop it. And that was the end of the week that day. and into the heights, the big Hog's Back that's up above the Sea of Galilee, went Jewish planes and tanks. The strike was hard. There were heavy casualties on both sides. And do you know what happened? The United Nations immediately met and condemned Israel for aggressive action. David Ben-Gurion says, I don't care what you call it or how you condemn us, you take absolutely no cognizance of the provocative attacks we are constantly being harassed by. And as of not too long ago, the number got to 100,000 that the United Nations officials actually recorded where the Israelis had been attacked from across the border in one way or another. So this has happened over and over again. There would be a series of provocative actions. The Israelis would retaliate officially, and then they would be condemned. Now the last one was not a good one. I don't know why Eshkol became confused, but just about a year and a half ago, 1966, and no longer than that, he was so upset by the Syrians constantly shooting. They were bringing their tanks right down into Israel and firing. And they were threatening to annihilate whole villages. And so many people had been killed that Eshkol finally said, we're going to make an example out of one of your villages. Then Egypt rose up and said, if you attack anything in Syria, it will be an attack on Egypt, because we have always been closely aligned. So Eshkol decided to attack a village, El Samu, in Jordan. He went in, they attacked the village, warned all the people to get out, and then began to demolish the houses, the mud houses that the people lived in. And this was to try and tell the Arabs that they shouldn't attack Israel. Well, now Hussein, who was the king of Jordan, realized what the Jews were trying to do, because he had told Syria not to provoke the Israelis this way. And you would have thought he would have been the most angry of all when one of his own villages was demolished after the attacks were coming from other Arabs. But he kept his head and said to his people, the Jews were trying to make a point to us as an Arab people. They've made their point. Now everybody relax and let's stop this provocative action. But the people rose up and they almost had civil war over there. They demanded guns and so forth, and he was threatened with being pulled from the throne. So you see, just back in 1966, this thing was really boiling up. And so finally, in 1967, we began to see a whole new program initiated. The propaganda coming out of Cairo when I was there in the fall of 66 and again in the spring of 67, just before the war, it was the kind of language you'd never expect to hear in the 20th century. Every 2 hours, this broadcast would come out of Cairo in Hebrew, saying, Jews, prepare for death. Your end is nigh. Revenge for 1948 and 1956 is coming. Prepare to die. And then it would be broadcast in Arabic so that their own people would understand what they were saying. The same thing would come out of Damascus. It was very much like the propaganda, the violent propaganda back in the days of Hitler. And if I turn just briefly to one or two of those you just might be interested in. The Arab national aim is elimination of Israel. This is a fight for the homeland. It is either us or the Israelis. There is no middle road. The Jews of Palestine will have to leave. We will facilitate their departure to their former homes. Any of the old Palestinian Jewish population who survive may stay, but it is my impression that none of them will survive. I mean, how'd you like to hear that dinned into your ears? And not understanding the language that I was listening to, I'd have it interpreted. And later I got English translations of it to make sure I was getting it straight. But that's the kind of thing that's been coming out of those radios continuously. And now it was building up in the spring of 67. And then it looked as though the $2 billion worth of arms that Nasser had received was enough so that he was prepared to strike. And so he announced, and you probably have heard this before, we intend to open a general assault against Israel. This will be total war. Our basic aim is the destruction of Israel. And immediately the religious element began to call for what they call jihad, or a holy war. Well, now here is the timetable. Here's the way that thing unfolded in that very last period just before the war struck. May the 8th, the Arab terrorists were as far as 5 miles inside of Israel, mining roads and shooting and killing. May the 14th, Nasser announced that the troops were now going to move to the border of Israel, and they began marching across Sinai with tanks, half-tracks, and so forth. May the 15th, Nasser announces Israel is mobilizing troops to attack Syria, and that's why he's taking this action. The United Nations says you are wrong. There has been no general mobilization inside of Israel. May the 16th, Nasser demands removal of UN troops that he asked to have put there in 1956. Now he says, get them out. And U Thant, the Secretary General of the UN, removed them without even asking the Security Council or the General Assembly, which caused great consternation at the time because it was a high-handed action, everyone felt. May the 22nd, Nasser closes the Aqaba Gulf. Now, at the head of the Red Sea, you see Egypt's over here, Arabia over here, Palestine up here. At the head of the Red Sea, there are 2 horns, you remember? And one is the Suez Gulf that goes up to the Suez Canal into the Mediterranean. The other is the Aqaba Gulf that goes up to the Dead Sea. And in between, the Sinai Peninsula. Remember that in your Sunday school maps. All right, now the Aqaba Gulf is the way that the Jews had been getting 90% of all their oil. They were not allowed to use the Suez Canal even though it was guaranteed to them in 1956. They never got to use it. Their lifeline depended upon oil going through Aqaba Gulf, and on the 22nd, Nasser closed it, summarily. Now the UN troops have been pushed out, the Aqaba Gulf is closed, and Israel said, that is an act of war. British petroleum ships tried to come up Aqaba Gulf. Egyptian cannons fired on them and pushed them back out. That was when the first shooting of the war actually started. Now, the Israelis had to decide how they would react. A war had been started against them. What would they do? They watched about 900 tanks of the latest Soviet make roll right down to their border on the south, all along the Gaza Strip, all down the Negev for 117 miles, tanks, troops by the tens of thousands, all ready to attack. The radio in Cairo said, we are poised, we are ready, we will attack now almost within hours. And so it was obvious that great trouble was coming. Now, in addition to that, the Egyptians had a navy equipped by the Soviet Union with all of these fire-consuming weapons, the rockets and so forth, missiles that could be fired onto the shore and make ashes out of Tel Aviv and Haifa, the 2 main centers of Israel, in just hours. So they had the navy, they had the tanks. Over 1 million men were going to be involved in this war. This was no mere skirmish. 1 million men were in uniforms in this war when it hit. And the Arabs had 3 times as many tanks, about as many more soldiers, twice as many bombers, twice as many fighter planes, and they were all the latest ones. The Jews had to make over World War II tanks. A lot of their equipment was improvised, but they did have good French jet fighters that they'd been able to buy. Now, as this thing began to tighten, Eshkol said to the United States, remember what you promised us. The Aqaba Gulf is closed. We're breathing with one lung. What are you going to do about it? The United States says, we can handle the Soviet Union. Trust us. The Soviet Union will handle Nasser. Trust the Soviet Union. Eshkol says, well, I have up to now. I've been trusting all of you. But look what's happening. And Eshkol, being a socialist himself, just like Nasser, hardcore left-wing socialist, leaning very strongly toward the Soviet Union, depending upon the Soviet Union, not being pro-communist, being anti-communist, but believing that the collectivist state was the hope of helping people and setting up proper welfare, etc. He said, I have been trusting all of you. But look at the jam we're in now. What are you going to do about it? So on the 29th of May, now we're getting very close to war, the United States said to 50 other maritime powers, let's open up the Aqaba Gulf. Follow us. It sounded as though there was going to be an American man of war, go right up the Aqaba Gulf, and the oil ships could follow, and that'd be the end of that. Do you know who followed? Nobody. So what did the United States do? Nothing. And Levi Eshkol, the head of the prime minister, turned to his people and said, we are in bitter trouble. Now, what do people do? You've got less than 3 million people facing the resources of 110 million in the opposite side with one of the great powers of the world backing it. And the other great power of the world backing down. What do you do? And about this time, the Israelis got some very bad news from the International Red Cross. You may have forgotten it, but it was a rather sensational disclosure. The Red Cross verified in an official report that Nasser had vast poison gas equipment and had been using it in Yemen against fellow Arabs. And many of their bodies had been exhumed, and they had been killed with the most sophisticated kind of nerve gas and other chemical warfare materials furnished by the Soviet Union. The Jews were also advised that this equipment had all been moved up to their border now from Yemen. So this was death by fire, death by poison gas, death by bombing, just a complete annihilation of a people. As the chairman of the Palestine Liberation Organization said, it is my impression that none will survive. And he said it over and over again. And then they captured a military order in one of the areas. Listen to this. The reserve battalion of the brigade will raid the Motza colony, will destroy it, and kill all its inhabitants upon receiving the code signal from brigade headquarters. So when the Jews thought they were going to be annihilated, this definitely was being contemplated. They were going to be wiped out as a people, and any survivors would have been fragmentary. If you can imagine that happening in the 20th century, but that's what it was going to be, genocide for a whole nation. Now, at this point, the Jewish people got very unhappy with Eshkol, their prime minister, for fooling around depending upon other people and being so soft, waiting for the Soviet Union to put pressure on Nasser. Those who had their eyes open knew that it was the Soviet Union that was pressuring Nasser to do this. This was a Soviet operation. And so they started saying to Levi Eshkol, you are through. You are no leader. You are a coward. Step down and let somebody else have a go at it before we're all dead. And on June the 1st, to save himself politically, Levi Eshkol appointed as the defense minister the popular general of 1956, Dayan, the one-eyed general. He immediately made a survey of all of the resources. He checked and found that Itzhak Rabin, the general whom he had trained, had done a marvelous job tuning up whatever resources the Jews had so that it was ready to go. He then sat down with the cabinet of Levi Eshkol, and they said to him, we are now turning over to you the complete authority to decide when to fight, how to fight, and how extensively. You have the full authority and responsibility. This is interesting. Once I lectured from this platform, and I told you about the soft team and the firm team. Every nation has them. The soft team had been in charge. And this is what they do in a crisis. Then they say to the firm team, all right, you wanted to take it in this moment of crisis. So Dayan got it, and Dayan belonged to a small party called the Raphi Party that David Ben-Gurion had created when he got very unhappy with Eshkol. And so this war was really fought in the tradition of David Ben-Gurion, the former prime minister, and Dayan, the general that he had trained and raised up. So as soon as these people turned all this authority over to Dayan, they said to him, now we suggest that if you hit, you just take little Gaza, which is on the soft underside of Israel, and then used that to bargain with Egypt for the opening of the Gulf. And don't do anything drastic. Don't move like you did in 56. Don't take the whole Sinai Peninsula. That's provocative. And so we are told that Diane said, I am in full charge of the military forces. Yes, yes. I am to decide when we strike. Yes, yes, yes. So, for 4 days, Diane got things prepared and going. Meanwhile, things are getting tighter, and on Sunday, which was June the 4th, I have a copy of U.S. News and World Report in which it came out and said, in this moment of crisis, the chances of Israel surviving an attack are almost nil. Everything militarily is against her. Diane knew that. So what did he announce? We want no help from any other country. We want no soldiers from Britain or the United States dying on our soil. We will take care of ourselves. It was an audacious, almost braggadocio announcement, you would have thought. But this man knew precisely what he was going to do. Sunday evening, the frogmen got in their torpedo boats, went out onto the Mediterranean Sea. Just over the horizon, they lined up all along Alexandria, Port Said, and the other bases of the Egyptians. The pilots of the Israeli Air Force were giving sleeping pills in the afternoon because of the excitement and the instructions they had received. They could not possibly have slept otherwise, because they knew that this was a life and death situation, not only for them individually, but for the whole nation. So the pilots went to sleep. The frogmen went to sea on the afternoon of Sunday, June the 4th, last summer. Shortly after midnight, the torpedo boats moved closer into shore, and the frogmen disengaged themselves and quietly swam through the waters. Every one of them assigned to a specific Egyptian ship, equipped by the Soviet Union with its missiles and rockets and fire bombs designed to destroy the population centers of Israel. The amazing fact is that not one single ship was able to go to sea by morning. Meanwhile, at 2 o'clock in the morning, all of the pilots were up, alerted, went out, found their ships fueled, the motors ready to go, the rockets were in place, the bombs were in place, and they took off. Now they had been told that because this was a one-strike operation, that is, they didn't have the bombs to come back and go over and over again the same territory. So the pilots were told to do whatever they had to do to make absolutely sure that the ship they were supposed to bomb was absolutely demolished. And the pictures that afterwards show what happened are almost unbelievable. Those bombs go right into the center of those Egyptian ships. They're not scattered around. They're not shotgun blasts. Everyone was rifled in. Do you know how those pilots did that? Many of them put their flaps down, their wheels down, and came in so slow that anti-aircraft fire could have just blasted them out of the sky. They risked that to make sure that that bomb that was so precious and of which they had so few went right in the center of that ship and destroyed it. Then they would come back for the next sortie, another bomb, center of another ship. Intelligence services had informed them so minutely that they didn't knock out any of the dummy ships that were put there to draw fire. They let those go. Don't waste bombs on dummy ships. Hit the fighters, hit the bombers, and they did. By daybreak, the war was literally over. It was now a question of mopping up and the inevitable consequences of having lost control of the air by Egypt. At 8 o'clock, having been advised that the air was fairly safe, nobody knew exactly how successful these raids had been. They had hit 25 airfields from Iraq to Luxor. In Cairo, they came in from the west. They didn't come in from the east where all the radar was. They flew around the Mediterranean, came in from the west and struck. So the Jews didn't know how successful they'd been, but they thought they had pretty good a chance in the air now. And so they ordered the tanks to attack down on the southern side of Israel into Gaza. Move out across the desert if you can. Well, here were these Russian tanks. They had 3-to-1 all entrenched, all ready to go, and they just blasted these Jewish tanks, and they could make no progress at all. And they fought muzzle to muzzle there for several hours until those planes, refueled, re-rocketed, came back. They smashed through, and by nightfall, the Jewish tanks were out on the desert and were in 3 spearheads headed for the Suez Canal. Now, all during the day, the Israeli radios had played patriotic music. No news. And it was like a funeral. Newsmen who were there said you couldn't tell but what at any moment everybody was going to be annihilated, including us. So we're making our dispatches as fast as we could and putting them on the air lest that be our last line. But over in the Arab countries, the reporters said, we had glorious reports of wonderful victories. Tel Aviv was in ashes. Israel had been cut in two at the waistline. It was just a matter of hours now. 150 Israeli planes shot down out of the air. Victory, victory, victory. The only problem was Arabs would look up and here were Jewish tanks rolling down the streets in some of their towns. And so by Monday night, the member of Parliament met in Israel at the Knesset headquarters there in Jerusalem. And they didn't really know what the situation was. And David Ben-Gurion and Diane had kept it a secret. It was their party now that was running the show, not Eshkol and the Mapai party. And so these men, all concerned and so forth, sitting there kind of wringing their hands, hoping everything would be all right, suddenly saw little 5x5 David Ben-Gurion stride into the room. He looked at them and he said, "Gentlemen, the photographs are developed. We have killed 387 Arab planes on the ground." 387. Within another hour, the tally came up to 410. The sky belonged to the Jewish jets. That's what that message meant. The Knesset couldn't hardly believe its ears. So it celebrated. Do you know what with? Pink lemonade. They all drank heartily. Pink lemonade. No vodka, no whiskey. Pink lemonade. Everybody's got to have his wits about him. So they celebrated pink lemonade. During that day, something unfortunate had happened, however. The Jews had pleaded with Jordan. Now, Jordan's to the east, you remember, which occupies Old Jerusalem and all the Holy Land territory from down along the Jericho and the Jordan River. The Jews had pleaded with them not to come into the war. They had said to the Jordanians, we have absolutely knocked the force out of the sky that the Egyptians have. And at that time, they weren't quite sure how effective it had been, but that's what they told them. They said, don't get into the war. We've gotten along pretty good together. We've offered to even let you keep Jerusalem if you'll just guarantee the peace. And they did that 2 years before. I wondered what was going to happen out of it. They said, don't come into the war. But unfortunately, King Hussein had turned his troops over to Egyptian generals. He'd done it about 3 days before. And on the afternoon of that first day, the Jordanian crack Arab League troops marched into Israel. Now the Jews never thought they would do it. They had practically no defense for their city of Jerusalem, which is right next to the old city. You see, in Jerusalem you've got the old city that you're familiar with, and then the Jews were forced to build a new Jerusalem, small n, over next to it. We know about another New Jerusalem, but they call theirs a New Jerusalem. And this was the city into which the Jordanians now marched. And so the Jews had to call back some of the tanks. They ordered some of the planes back. They didn't get there till midnight. And there was real ferocious hand-to-hand fighting all night, Monday night over to Tuesday morning. Now it was right on the border. Those of you who've been to the Holy Land remember Mendelbaum Gate, the only connection link between Jordan and Israel. And that's where much of the fighting took place, because that's where the bunkers were and all the points that guard the old city. At that point, or near there, we had one of our good friends. Those of you who have been to the Holy Land know that there are two places that are celebrated as the place where Jesus was crucified and buried. One is the Holy Sepulchre, which is honored by the Catholic faith. The other is the Garden Tomb, discovered by General Gordon in about 1885. And they couldn't find a tomb at first. They just found a hill that looked like a skull. They got all the brush off of it, and sure enough, where it was eroded away, the limestone was eroded away, it looked like a skull.
That's what Golgotha means, skull, place of a skull. So they said, maybe that is the Golgotha. So they began digging, and 5 years later they came across a garden, and then they moved over toward the cliff. There was a tomb. Now, whether it was the right one or not, I don't know. But I know this. You can get the spirit of the Easter better in the garden tomb than any place you can in all Jerusalem. Now, on some of our tours, we've had members of the Tabernacle Choir. And our good friend there, Dr. Matter, used to allow us to hold a little service. And our Tabernacle Choir members would sing, I know that my Redeemer liveth. It was such a sweet spirit. And Dr. Matter was so pleased and happy to have us come each time. And he'd let us have it privately and ask other people to please wait until we'd had our little service there. You see, when we told him goodbye last May, we didn't know that right there by the gate where he was shaking our hands, he would be shot and killed and lie unburied for 4 days on the second morning of the war. Dr. Matter. What he actually did was during the bombing, when the bombs were all falling right along the border, he took his wife and little adopted daughter and they went into the tomb so they wouldn't be hit by the bombs, and they slept there all night. Now, what he didn't know was that during the night, the Israeli soldiers had gradually driven back the Arabs in very fierce room-to-room fighting as well as building-to-building. And the Arab soldiers had a tactic of ripping off their uniforms when they realized they were defeated. They'd take off their uniforms and hide them under a bed or something, and they'd have just pajamas on. So that as the Israelis came by, they'd say shalom, and the Israeli soldiers would go by, then they'd grab a gun and shoot them. Now, this backfired, so that by the Tuesday morning, these Israeli soldiers had been fighting all night. And anyone that looked like an Arab in pajamas, you see, was considered to be one of the troops. And so they rang the door, the bell to the garden tomb. Dr. Matter came out of the tomb and up to the garden door, opened it up. There were 6 Israeli soldiers. He's Armenian Christian, dark in pajamas, these striped Arab pajamas. They shot him on the spot. They then came in, threw hand grenades, shot all around through the garden. And then the little girl came running out, screaming, "You've killed my daddy. You've killed my daddy." And then they realized it must be a civilian setting. And so they went out, closed the door behind them. The mother and the little girl then fled from the garden. And the fire was so intense the next several days that it wasn't until sometime later the Dominican monks were able to come in, and they buried Dr. Matter there, right in the garden. Well, Tuesday began an all-out assault across the desert. And I'll tell it just very briefly because the time is passing fast, and I want to mention another segment of this problem. Tuesday was the day that the Israelis got over across the desert almost all the way. They were racing their half-tracks, their tanks, their artillery as fast as they could. And you know what they were trying to do? Seal off this $1 billion or more worth of tanks and armament that the Soviet Union had given to the Arabs and destroy it or capture it. That's all they wanted to do. They didn't want to capture Cairo. They didn't want to defeat Egypt as a nation. They just wanted to destroy her capacity to come back and fight them again, because Israel had shot her wad, as we would say in the service. She was without any additional resources to defend herself. She had to smash the enemy's resources. And so her half-tracks were sent across the desert by 3 different routes, trying to reach the Suez Canal and seal off all means of escape. And one of the generals got there in an unbelievably fast time. He carried his gasoline with him. He went so fast that he got there ahead of another general coming along the coast. And then their communications got messed up somehow, and he was scared to death the other general would shoot him when it got to the pass, not realizing he could get there so soon. But they finally made communications, and they sealed it off. And you saw the pictures of Mitla Pass, where the Arab tanks were just a few feet, one behind another, and they'd shot it out with the Israelis muzzle to muzzle, hour by hour, until finally the pass definitely was held. Now, what about all these tanks on the desert? Hundreds and hundreds of them racing across the desert trying to get to the Suez Canal. The Jewish planes would come in and bomb a lead tank. And you probably saw the pictures. They were using something like the bullpup bomb, which can be guided by radar after it leaves the plane. And it would just blow that tank all to pieces. And then the next thing that would happen was all the other tanks would stop, hatches would go up, out would jump the crew and race out into the desert because they knew probably they would be next. But this was strategy. The Israelis did not intend to destroy any more tanks than they needed to. And then they would radio to the ground and tell a battalion that there was a whole group of tanks there with their motors still running. Move up with gasoline and white paint. And so that's what they would do. They'd come up and paint the Star of David on them, put a new crew inside, turn them around, and shoot back on into the war. And that's the way they captured over 350 tanks intact. Some of them were so new off the Russian assembly lines they hadn't even been camouflaged yet. Well, their objective was to destroy or capture all of this massive, expensive armament that Russia had furnished them. This was done mostly on Tuesday, partly on Wednesday. Well, it was on Wednesday that they finally captured Old Jerusalem. And as they captured Old Jerusalem, you had these Israeli soldiers who are completely irreligious. You may not realize it, but the Israelis have very few religious people among them. They are Jews, but they don't know why. They know that there's a great cause here, but they don't believe in God per se. They're agnostic or outright atheists. A few of them are like David Ben-Gurion, who believes that every prophecy in the Old Testament will be literally fulfilled. And there are a number like that. And then there are the Orthodox Jews, but they're definitely a minority. The vast majority of the Israelis, they feel they have a destiny, but it is not identified with religious principles. This is a surprise to people. Some of them who have been converted to the LDS faith, for example, will say, I first had to become a good Jew and then a Christian. I had to kind of go through those steps and realize who I was and what our destiny was. It's kind of interesting that should be the case. But among the Israeli troops, they had a very fine chaplain. And I just want you to read what he said as they came up to the Wailing Wall. You see, they captured Old Jerusalem finally, and here's this chaplain who's like David Ben-Gurion. He believes that there's a destiny, that these people have a service to render, and that they have a responsibility. And so he looked around, and here were these agnostic Jewish soldiers, tears running down their faces, putting on little caps, kissing the Wailing Wall, the only remnant of the old temple, saying little prayers they don't even understand. And so as the prime minister came together with the mayor from the Arab side, they stood there and had a little service. And the old chaplain, his name is Rabbi Goren, he raised his face toward the heavens and he said, "We have taken the city of God. We are entering the Messianic era for the Jewish people. And I promise the Christian world that we are responsible for. We will take care of the holy places of all religions here. For all people, I promise them, we will take care of your holy places." And so they had this little service, and then they adjourned. Now, by Wednesday, it was all over for Jordan. The guns were silenced. The Jews had not only taken Jerusalem, they had Bethlehem, they had Hebron to the south, they had Nablus to the north, they had rolled right down to the Jordan River, they had Jericho, they occupied all the western shore of the Dead Sea. They practically had everything David had. It was unbelievable. The Jews who had tried to bargain away all this territory 2 years before for peace suddenly found themselves with twice the population and 4 times the territory, including one of the richest tourist centers of the entire world. And they never designed it that way. But the prophets had talked about it nearly 3,000 years ago and said it would come to pass. So Wednesday, Jordan was out. Thursday, Egypt was out. Friday, the Syrians who'd been attacking by planes and so forth were attacked. And Saturday, the Syrians collapsed. The Jews fought their way all up those heights I was telling about, over the Hog's Back, over the Golan Heights, headed down toward Damascus. They could have taken Damascus. Damascus was just paralyzed with fear. When we were there in May, I said to my guide, "What are all these tank traps all along the road?" Oh, he said, those are left over from World War II. Well, the cement was hardly dry, it looked like. So they were expecting trouble. And in this hour, when the war ended in 6 days, the Arab nation was stunned. Russia was stunned. The world was stunned. And I was so fearful that we would miss it, just like we did in 48 and 49. We didn't have a single book come out on it among our people here. We missed it. It was one of those great events that prophets had talked about for so long, and I was fearful we'd miss it again. So we worked day and night for about 5 months to put together the whole picture so that our people would realize that in the year 1967, in the month of June, we were the witnesses to a fantastic victory that the prophets had talked about. Now let me just talk a little bit about the future and then I'll close. They've also told us now what's going to happen. The Jews are not going to be driven out, but they are not going to have peace. There's going to be a very prickly period now, the series of contests. And you're going to have the attempt of the Soviet Union to confront the United States again and again over these people. They will be used as a tool. You see, the policy of the Soviet Union is to fight Israel down to the last Arab. That's the way they fight wars. And so it's going to go on. So they're getting ready for a second round. And do you know what the Bible says will happen if they attack again? The Jews will get more territory. And before they're through, Ezekiel he mapped it for us. It's right in the Scripture. He mapped how much territory they're going to have, and it isn't very much, actually. But it's a good deal of Jordan and most of Syria. And he says that is the territory she will need to perform her great service in the latter days. And then Zechariah and Ezekiel, Isaiah say what's going to happen to the Jews. Zechariah especially, he just really jumps on his people of the latter days, being a Jew himself. And he says, your years of persecution will have left its scars. You will have become immoral. You will have lost your God. And he says, God will thresh you until you come forth with clean hands and are strong, ready to perform the great service of building the temple with clean hands. Now, we've known for quite a while that there was leadership in Israel that was fully appreciative of the destiny they have to fulfill and were very humble about it, and not knowing how God would work it out. And they've been very appreciative of the fact that in 1841, Orson Hyde went onto the slopes of Mount of Olivet and dedicated it. You see, this is well known at the Hebrew University. This is well known among Jewish scholars, that Orson Hyde dedicated that land for the return of the Jews before the Zionist movement was ever organized. And in the 1870s, President Young sent back George Albert Smith and others to plead with the Lord to hasten the day. And 5 years later, the first Aliyah began, which was the first wave of return to Jerusalem. And they've been coming by the thousands ever since. Now they have a temple to build. And they're talking about it already. They have to build a temple. Where are they going to build it? They're going to build it where Solomon's temple was, they say. Where's that? When you see Jerusalem today, here's a great mammoth temple square, about 32 acres square. In the center of it, over a certain rock, is a beautiful dome, a Muslim mosque, about the second most holy place in all Muslim. Do you know what that rock is supposed to represent? That's where the Holy of Holies of Solomon's temple was. That's the rock on which Isaac was offered as a sacrifice, according to their tradition. That's the rock from which Mohammed ascended into heaven in the 8th century A.D. in a vision and got his commission from Adam and Moses and all the rest. That's a very sacred place to Jews and Arabs, and the Arabs possess it. And the Jews say, we will not injure the sacred places of the Muslims or the Christians, but we will build our temple. And so Newsweek said, how are you going to build it, Rabbi? Well, he said, I don't know. It's God's problem. All we're supposed to do is to collect the material and get ready to rebuild it. The way in which we shall do it, the time in which we shall do it, that is God's plan. They're going forward in absolute faith that somehow it will work out. So in the Fantastic Victory, I have a chapter on the building of the temple. And I said, just so that we will not take it for granted when it happens, because there is going to be a temple there. And it will come about by a very natural course of events. Just so we won't take it for granted, let us spread across the record in 1967 that the building of a Jewish temple where the Dome of the Rock now is in the center of Mount Moriah is an absolute political impossibility. Which it is. Because the Arabs have all announced that the entire Muslim world will rise up in a holy massacre war if they touch the Dome of the Rock. So that's the situation. Just as our book was going to press, I learned that something rather interesting had happened. Here is a quote from the Protestant newspaper, The Christian and Christianity Today, for August 1967. It says, 500 rail car loads of stone from Bedford, Indiana, considered to be among the finest building stone in the world, is being freighted pre-cut to exact specifications, and one consignment has already been dispatched to Israel. This report, received from authoritative sources in Sellersburg, Indiana, said cornerstones for the third Jerusalem temple are already in Israel. Materials for this temple have been secretly in preparation for 7 years, the report went on, and it is believed American Jews are mainly responsible for financially undergirding the whole project. Things are really moving fast. Now, this was denied by the Limestone Institute of Indiana. They said there is no such shipment of stone going out. So I called Mr. MacDonald, who is the president, and told him that another printing of my book was going out, and if that was not an accurate quote, I wanted him to tell me. I said, I've been informed that you have denied that any such shipment went out. He said, yes, we did. But he said, things have changed since then. I said, what happened? He said, it isn't anything I can tell you about, but we're no longer making a comment on this. However, he said, I will say to you that a couple of things have come to our attention which indicate that it might be entirely possible. And I said, well, maybe I can call you back in a week and you can verify for me what you found out, because I want the information to be as accurate as I can. He said, don't call me in a week. This will take a long time to find out about. He said, I've never run into such a cloak and dagger operation. So apparently it's being very confidentially handled, but that's the report I have for you as of tonight, that they at least have run into something that has made them feel that that wasn't just a rumor after all. Now there's one other thing up the front that we ought to talk about. We don't know how far ahead it is, but the Jews are going to completely build all that territory around there, and they're going to make it wealthy and pleasant and desirable. And it will be so desirable that in the not too distant future there will be a mammoth conglomeration of Gentile nations from the north that Ezekiel describes in such detail, as do several of the other prophets. They will sweep down on the Jews and they will have their Armageddon. Now, it isn't too far away, but they must have finished their temple before this can take place. Some people thought this last war was Armageddon. No, the temple isn't built yet. And Armageddon doesn't come until after the temple is built. And those forces will sweep down with such ferocity the Jews wouldn't have any possibility of surviving. And so John the Revelator says, I want to tell you about the two prophets. They'll be raised up and will stand in the midst of that city and will speak out so that the very elements will be consumed as they speak, as though a flame came from their mouths to hold back these great forces that will sweep down upon them. And the prophet Joel, in describing this battle, says, I want you to understand what I saw. There's never been anything as terrible in all the history of mankind as what I saw. And then he describes what sounds very much like modern mechanized war. He said, before them a garden of Eden, and then flame, and behind them a wilderness. And he says that I see them marching like men, like horses. They roar on the tops of the mountains. Nothing can stop them as they march forward. You can almost see him describing tanks and planes and flamethrowers. It's all there. It'll be a terrible experience for the Jews. And the war will come right to the gates of the temple. And then the two prophets will be killed at the end of a 3.5 year siege. One half of the city will be devastated, the women will be ravished, and great and terrible affliction will be suffered by the people. And then the leader of these Gentile nations, who's described by Daniel as the worst dictator the earth has ever seen, will have a celebration because they have finally killed these two men that had power over the elements and could hold them back just by their speech. And while these two men are lying dead in the streets, prophets of God, they will celebrate for 3.5 days. And then there will be a voice from heaven which will call these two men. They will rise to their feet, apparently in glorified, resurrected bodies, and will ascend. And immediately the Messiah will appear with his hosts on the Mount of Olives to the east of Jerusalem. The mountain will cleave in twain, one portion moving to the south, the other to the north. A great valley will open up, which will allow the people to flee into Jehoshaphat. And the people will flee desperately to escape these terrible forces of war that have now surrounded them. And as they get over into the other valley, if they just look over their shoulders, they will see this great consumption by fire of the hosts of Gog and Magog. And then as they gather around their Messiah, there'll be such a great satisfaction in their hearts, because he came just like they always said he would come. Not a humble Galilean walking down there barefoot, as Christians believe. He came in power and strength and glory. And the elements obeyed him, and the mountain cleaved, just as Zechariah predicted it would, and they were able to escape just like he said they would. And they were saved from this abomination of war that had surrounded them. That's what they'd been expecting. That's what they finally had. And in triumph they will surround their Messiah, who will stand in their midst, Zechariah says. And then in this Jewish scripture, it describes a fantastic development. It says, and this is the Savior speaking to Zechariah in this revelation, he says, and then one of them will say, to me who was pierced, what are these wounds in thy hands and thy feet? And I will say, these are the wounds I received in the house of my friend. And this Jewish prophet Zechariah says, immediately the whole nation will go into mourning, for now they will know that, fantastic as it may seem, this great, magnificent personality standing before them, who manifested such marvelous power to save them in their moment of travail, was the very one who was pierced and killed, rejected, and not recognized as their Messiah in the meridian of time. And then, after the hosts of Gog have been killed, it'll take months to clean up the land. There'll be a long period then, we don't know how many years, but it'll be a little while, as the people then prepare this land for the return of the 10 tribes who will have been in America in the meanwhile, receiving their covenants, getting ready to go over. In the past, sometimes we've thought that the appearance of Christ on the Mount of Olives is the second coming. No, there's quite an interval between his appearance to the Jews and his appearance to all flesh. And it's quite a different setting. And there's quite a period of cleansing the land, building it all up, getting ready for the millennial period. And the Savior will then come through the eastern entrance of that magnificent temple, which will have been built according to specifications that are in the Bible. Some people say, how will they have known how to build a temple? It's in the last 10 chapters of Ezekiel. 600 BC, God, knowing that the temple would have to be built when they had neither Urim nor Thummim, had Ezekiel go through the temple in vision with an angel. And the angel gave him all the dimensions and had him write them down. They're right in the last 10 chapters of Ezekiel, just how it will be set up. And they're to have a great leader named David, a descendant of Jesse, half Ephraim, or part Ephraim and part Jew. And he will be their leader. And he will be the one who directs the building of the temple. He will be the one who welcomes the Messiah. He will be the one who conducts him into the temple through the east door. And then the door will be closed and never opened again. The name of the city of Jerusalem will be changed from Jerusalem to a name which in Hebrew means God is here. And then it says, all the sacrifices and everything performed by the sons of Levi will be offered unto the Lord in righteousness. The sons of Levi will offer unto the Lord an offering in righteousness. And then apparently, according to the words that John the Baptist used at the time the Aaronic priesthood was restored, then there will be a change made. The sons of Levi will have offered their offering in righteousness, just like Zacharias said they would. And then the higher ordinances can be used in that temple. In the 4,000 years, we included a lot about the temple of Solomon, and found some passages that indicated that there were upper rooms in that temple where nobody was allowed to go except very special people for very special purposes. Josephus says we really don't know why they had it, really, but it was gold-lined. We know that, and the Bible says that as a matter of fact. And it's in the Doctrine and Covenants that we learn that the higher ordinances were performed in that day and in that temple. And this temple will have the same basic structure as that ancient temple did. Same dimensions, a beautiful building. So this is the day in which we live. And you and I are witnesses to the literal fulfillment of a prophecy that the world has almost forgotten already. They scarcely realize what a tremendous thing just happened. And so that you can catch the spirit of the Israeli leadership, I want to just say a word here about the goal that the Israeli leadership has. I want to just read to you some of the things that David Ben-Gurion has written about the major problems that now face the state of Israel. We must dispel the hostility of the encircling Arab peoples and make a covenant of peace between them and Israel that will culminate in economic, cultural, and political cooperation and advance the well-being of the whole Middle East. That's the Ben-Gurion spirit. Then he says we must encourage the Arab countries to set up democratic governments, because he said otherwise their leaders will exploit them as they have in the past. Said lastly, we must play our part in ensuring social progress and in shaping a new society wherein there is neither exploitation nor discrimination, a society built upon mutual aid and love of mankind. Our prophets in ancient days demanded that the Jews be a dedicated people and a light and a service to others. No Jew must forget that lesson. Every Jew is guided in his course, wittingly or unwittingly. He knows many of them are atheists. By that aspiration, by a conviction that the source of Israel's rebirth and strengthening is trust in the purpose its prophets preached. But whenever any group of them line up against God's purposes, whether they are Jewish, Arab, American, Russian, British, French, African, Latin American, they will fail. Prophecy is against them. Destiny is against them. And they who will stand courageously for right, for principle, these are they that will be sustained. And the promise of the prophets is they will prevail. So what we've talked about tonight was not only an amazing, miraculous victory for these people who were over there fighting for their very existence. It was also a fantastic victory for God and the prophet.